Well, let's get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Tim, for that fantastic overview on the state of the industry, and thank you all for joining us today in this panel entitled Executive Outlook, Wins, Raises, and Renewed Confidence in Regenerative Medicine. I'm Geulah Livshits, a biotech analyst at Chardan in New York, and Chardan has a long history of activity in the genetic medicine space. I'm a scientist by training and did a good amount of genetic engineering in my past life, so it's been really fascinating to see this then as a sell-side analyst, to see the successes and the challenges of the companies navigating this process of transitioning science to medicines, as well as with also navigating the evolving macroclimate over the past several years. So in this session, we'll be speaking with executives from companies developing 3 different modalities who will share their perspectives. So thank you, Gwen, Allan, and Curran, for joining us today. And maybe to start, I'll invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their companies. And we'll start with you, Gwen.
Okay. Well, first, thank you for having me here. It's really wonderful to be part of this annual event. I appreciate the invitation. I'm Gwendolyn Binder, President of Science and Technology at Cabaletta Bio. Cabaletta Bio is a publicly traded biotechnology organization located in Philadelphia. So I don't know how many of you out there are American football fans, but we are a little bit in mourning this morning. But we are developing engineered T-cell therapy for autoimmune disease. We were one of the first movers in the space. Our lead product is called resacaptogene autoleucel. It's a CD19 targeted chimeric antigen receptor that was designed for safety. And we have entered into our pivotal studies. We have a BLA planned for 2027, and we have clinical trials ongoing and multiple additional indications that are reading out in the first half of this year as well. Really think that this is part of the sort of the next generation of opportunity for CAR T-cell therapy, and so looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Allan?
Thanks, and thanks for having me here. So Allan Reine, I'm the CEO of Prime Medicine. Prime is the company is really founded based on our technology, which is prime editing. I think prime editing is really emerging as the sort of preeminent gene editing technology. I think that's based on a couple of things. One, it's the versatility of what we can do with this technology, so we can really do any type of edit, really of any size. And it's really the safest way, we think, to edit the genome. This is a technology that we've been pushing forward for about 6 years now. Last year, we reported our first clinical data for a smaller disease with an ex vivo therapy in something called CGD. We're now about to enter the clinic with our first in vivo programs directed at a couple of different, directed at the liver, one for Wilson disease, one for alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. We're also working in cystic fibrosis and with BMS with our ex vivo CAR T cell therapies. But there's so much more we can do with this technology over time. This is where we're working today.
Great. And Curran?
Hi, Curran Simpson, President and CEO at REGENXBIO. I don't think I have to say a lot. Tim did a great job of introducing the company. In fact, I think I'll draft him for my corporate update later in the week. But we're an AAV-based company. We've been in business for roughly 15 years, all the way back to Jim Wilson's lab at UPenn. And we have real exciting data coming out this year. We have pivotal data on our Duchenne program. We have pivotal data later in the year for our wet AMD program. And we have an ongoing BLA review for Hunter syndrome that's in progress. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Fantastic. So maybe let's start off with a high-level temperature check. So as we get into 2026, how would you characterize the sentiment around your different segments of the cell and gene therapy space, and how do you see that having evolved over the past year? Let's start with you, Curran.
Yeah, I think for the reasons I just mentioned, we're coming into the year sort of shot out of a cannon. We have a lot of really exciting data. I think high probability events coming up in terms of the outcomes from our pivotal studies. I think AAV gene therapy, as mentioned earlier, that like other industries, has had ups and downs. The downs have primarily been due to things like safety, which we've been addressing 15 years of experience in AAV. We've incorporated all the learnings over the years to make things safer, make delivery safer even for high dose AAV. So I think we come into the year on a technical basis very enthusiastic, and then I think the investment community is coming along with that. So I think nothing but optimism for 2026.
Allan?
Yeah, I think sentiment today is actually, it's in a good place, and I think getting better. I think if you look at, if I just kind of take a step back, big picture, you look at the XBI, I think it's, if we go back to JP Morgan last year, we're up about, I don't know, close to 40%. But it's probably up about 70+% from the low, right? So that's a nice year, but remember, the XBI was probably down over 20% at some point last year, if you probably looked at sort of the June lows. And then the cell and gene therapy space really even underperformed the broader XBI. So sentiment, I would say in May, June, could not have been worse. I think there were a lot of things that happened that you could tell at the time even that it really was a structural shift with how investors are looking at the space. I absolutely think the FDA and the flexibility, and we'll get into talking more about that today, I think, it was a big part of it. Obviously, sentiment can only get so low, so the pendulum has swung so far one way. We're either burning all our cash and never creating any value, or there's some value in these companies, and I think investors saw that. And I think there were some other sort of positive events that happened in the space with respect to data and other things. So, I think there's a ton of opportunity. Remember, obviously AAV is more mature than gene editing, but you're seeing some blockbusters now in AAV-based therapies. You're seeing gene editing programs really mature, where you have, obviously the first ex vivo approval, phase 3s in later stage development. So as I see it, this is a maturing sector in the sense that we're now building commercial value, and people can now translate early sort of data to what that can mean commercially. And I think we're just getting started there.
Gwen?
Yeah. So leaving the mixed one for last, I would say I agree with the shift in the sentiment regarding investors in the biotech space. But for engineered ex vivo autologous engineered T-cell therapy, I think it's sort of a tale of two cities still. And I think that's one of the stories we're trying to share this year, is why we're sort of moving into a next generation of opportunity for cell therapy. I think we'll touch on some of those aspects today. But in terms of the opportunity in autoimmune disease with this therapeutic modality, patients, providers, and they're really seeing that this is transformational. Patients are able to go off of their therapies, their chronic therapies, and the physicians are seeing a good safety and efficacy and durability profile, and it's really exploding, and that's why there are so many companies in this space. I think there is such an overhang from CAR-T, from the oncology experience. So, Tim just talked about the successes in hematologic malignancies and how this is now becoming a blockbuster drug, and how we're reaching through to outpatient administration and more patient access. But I think investors are concerned about, are you going to see the same value proposition with this therapy because we've been burned in the past? And I think the answer is a clear yes, because the pricing opportunities are there, the cost of goods are there, and the patient experience is different, the durability of treatment, being able to get away from preconditioning. All of that is there with autoimmune, and now there's also ways to automate manufacturing that allow you to scale. So there's a lot of things that have happened in the infrastructure of cell therapy and elements of autoimmune disease that make this opportunity a real positive value proposition, but I think that's still a story that is being told now, and so hopefully we'll gain the same positive sentiment from investors as well this year. So.
Yep, absolutely. So maybe to get a little more specific, I think each of your companies was able to secure some additional funding in 2025, either through... Is the mic working now?
Yeah, maybe hold it up.
How's that? Let's see. All right, so I think each of your companies was able to secure some additional financing this year, either through equity raises or non-dilutive means. Can you tell a little bit about what your investors or deal partners were looking for that got them excited? You can start with Allan.
Yeah, so we did a financing last summer, and that was really based on us refocusing the company. And so what that means is when I joined Prime in about 2 years ago, almost to the day, we had 18 programs in the pipeline, right? Something that probably wasn't sustainable. Investors would look at us and be like, what are you guys doing exactly? And so, it was a way to really say, where can we spend? Like, what's the right capital allocation strategy for the company? What's something that we believe in? What's something that we can get our board to believe in? And what's something we can get our investors to believe in? And we went through a pretty rigorous analysis to figure out what that capital allocation strategy should be. So we really, focus the pipeline to the few programs that we're working on today, where we really try and marry both where do we think we have high probability of success, and where do we see, high probability of commercial success. And where that Venn diagram, when we get to that middle part of that Venn diagram, those are sort of the programs that we take forward today. As these technologies improve, or delivery technologies improve to the brain and other areas, hopefully that middle part of that Venn diagram is going to continue to grow, and it'll make sense to spend some other capital there. And the other piece is, where do you really see sort of timing of some of your catalysts? So investors want to know, and again, not every investor is the same. Some are long-term investors, some are shorter-term investors, but it's a lot of, what programs you're working on, what's the potential, when are the catalysts? And you really have to be able to tell that story well to your stakeholders.
Curran?
Yeah, knowing that we had these pivotal catalysts in 2026, 2025 was more a year of being creative. And so we did 2 different things last year. We partnered our Hunter program with NS Pharma, and I think it was just a great decision in terms of having a commercial-ready organization join up with us for our first launch. That brought in well over $100 million in an upfront, which we announced actually a year ago. And then we also did a royalty monetization. So we've had an IP estate for years that has really paid dividends for us in terms of seeding other companies with our technology. And so we were able to do royalty monetization. So all together, we raised over $250 million last year. And again, knowing that this year we had these big pivotal catalysts, put us in a position of strength coming into 26.
Got it. Gwen?
Yeah. So we were really pleased to be able to issue a public offering for $100 million last year. It was a very difficult market in 2024 and 2025. So I think being able to raise those funds, was a positive validation of our data and the company. We were able to raise that because we announced clarity on our pivotal clinical trial approach with our lead program, myositis. And it's an innovative approach, a single-arm clinical study, relatively small trial due to the unmet medical need, and that allowed us to forecast a BLA submission in 2027. So I think investors are really looking for those value-driving milestones. So so knowing that their money will get you to the next inflection point. Yeah.
Yep, makes sense. All right, so maybe let's jump to one of the big discussion points of the past year, which I think Tim alluded to, which was dynamics at the FDA, where we had leadership turnover at the agency. There were some reversals with respect to alignment on some specific programs, but also some new alignments on single-arm trials, as well as positive commentary on the cell and gene therapy space and initiatives to expedite therapies particularly for rare diseases with high unmet need, culminating, as Tim alluded to, in some additional commentary over this weekend as well on expediting some CMC and clinical requirements. So I'd like to get each of your perspectives on that regulatory environment. And maybe let's start with Curran. REGENXBIO, as you mentioned, has a PDUFA date coming up soon for Hunter syndrome, as well as the pivotal readouts in Duchenne and wet AMD on deck for later this year. So tell us about your experience with the regulatory environment, as well as your level of confidence with respect to the regulatory paths for your programs.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think what I've learned in the last 6 months is how difficult a job the FDA reviewers have in rare disease. You think about it, you're used to 600 patient trials with a placebo arm, and then in rare disease, you're dealing with tens of patients, no placebo arm. So it's a difficult job, and I think what we're really pleased to see is the messages from leadership reinforcing plausible mechanism pathways, reinforcing surrogate biomarkers. And so when I put it all together and I think about our review process, we've had a really fantastic facility inspection with no observations. It helps FDA. I think they live next door, so they get to see the plant sometimes in training as well. So I think we have a good collaborative relationship. We've had good face-to-face meetings with FDA, which is very heartening. And so we're hopeful that our Hunter program fits like a hand in glove for what the leadership has been telling us, and we have every reason to look for a positive outcome at the PDUFA date.
And any read-through or lack thereof from the big stories from last year within the AAV gene therapy space on the regulatory side?
In terms of, I think the one that probably more particular to Hunter is the approval of IT Ibisma for Novartis, because the intrathecal injection is the same methodology we use for Hunter. So I think it's those examples that are really direct to gene therapy that tell me that the agency is backing up what they're saying about gene therapy and moving those programs along.
Got it. And Gwen, so I understand Cabaletta is in the process of getting ready to get to alignment with the FDA on the registrational cohort designs for rese-cel. So I guess what is your sense of the regulatory environment for CAR Ts in autoimmune disease in general and for your specific programs? And how are you seeing any similarities and differences in how the agencies are looking at oncology versus autoimmune disease in this setting?
No, thanks. I mean, similar to Curran, I think CAR T offers something the FDA has said that they're looking for, which is the ability to offer, transformative, outcomes in patients, allow them to get off of their therapies. And they've been very flexible in allowing us to address this through innovative clinical trial design in rare disease settings, and also so that has remained an approach that has been consistent from time under Peter Marks to under Vinay Prasad, who even brought together a whole cell and gene therapy panel in which they're really trying to promote therapies that allow patients to get off chronic therapy. So we've had multiple interactions with the FDA. As I mentioned, we have alignment on our pivotal approach for myositis. We just announced this morning we've also reached alignment with lupus, and we're in discussions for systemic sclerosis. And we're getting consistent feedback from the FDA that in these diseases where there's unmet need, single-arm studies are acceptable. We haven't seen any major shifts there. I will say we have seen some effects of the turnover, but it hasn't affected the regulatory advice or our clinical development strategies. It's just required us as experienced drug developers to maybe lean in and help a little bit more, and maybe have a few more conversations.
That's encouraging to hear. So moving to Allan, FDA leadership was clearly very inspired by the baby KJ story, and they've talked about that. They've also, as Tim mentioned earlier, have alluded to increasing flexibility, potential umbrella trials, to different ways to leverage genome editing as a platform. How could some of these comments and potential pathways work for a company like Prime to leverage in your pipeline?
Yeah, so I can cite a few examples, and again, when we go back, and I talked a little bit about the sentiment change sort of in June, and some of the commentary and the rhetoric was shifting, we're starting to see that actually play out now. So the few examples I'll cite are, one, the ability to do say multiple different mutations within the same disease under one IND. So the FDA has, I think, publicly talked about that for the urea cycle disorders, right? We feel the feedback we've gotten, we feel pretty good that we'll be able to do that with respect to our Wilson studies. That's in the US. We actually think Europe is starting to shift as well. Again, I'm not saying they're there yet, but they're at least starting to consider things and starting to move, which is very different than where they were a year ago. We always talk about the ability to leverage from one program to the next. And without getting into specifics, we've gotten recent feedback that's allowing us to leverage, as an example, some of our IND-enabling studies from one program to the next. So this isn't one mutation, this is one disease to the next, where, for our LNP delivery, as an example, that is not changing. It's really the cargo that changes. So if the safety is driven by that, can we do all that? So that's a really positive update, we think, for us. Third, I think what you saw from Beam today, that, just validation, we always believe this, but I think a lot of investors were concerned, validation that you could use for their Alpha-1 program, AAT levels as a surrogate for accelerated approval. That's an important data point. Because again, I think a lot of things that happen, even if you had agreement with the FDA, and that's what the prior administration were seeing, all of those agreements might not be upheld. So you kind of need new agreements, and that's obviously a scary place if you want to go back and sort of open those decisions back up. And fourth, I do think the release yesterday can be a real positive. We've been talking a lot about the CMC behind the scenes with different stakeholders at the FDA and different stakeholders outside the FDA. This is an area that we think really needs to change. The FDA has shown flexibility, and now they're starting to show even more. We're still digesting sort of what this says, and it's definitely clear we need a little bit more clarity on what it means. But at a minimum, we're not going to need 3 PPQ lots to get something approved. There's the potential for, and the language is in there, concurrent validation even after approval. That could be game-changing for us, allowing us to go after even smaller diseases where it's going to be cost-effective for us to potentially enter. So I think when you put this all together, it means we can move these programs forward, and it should be, one, cheaper from program to program, but also faster. And I think that flexibility is important, and I'm glad to see it, and I think it's a potential real tailwind to the sector.
Fantastic. That is encouraging to hear. So maybe now let's move to a couple of modality-specific questions for each of you. And maybe let's start with Gwen. You talked about how the CAR T space has evolved with respect to the regulatory environment, but with respect to the space more broadly, and as we think looking ahead to the competitive landscape with bispecifics, in vivo CAR Ts, other modalities, can you talk a little bit about how the space has evolved in recent years, and in terms of learnings from the technologies, as well as how you envision things playing out competitively in the future versus in vivo CAR Ts, some of these other modalities that are coming up?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I think for a lot of people, it's sort of so confusing. There's so many new technologies coming out, and how do you think about it? So, I mean, first, with CAR T, since the initial approvals in 2017, we are in a completely different world, and Tim talked about some of that. Just in terms of the infrastructure that we have, first of all, for manufacturing, for one, so there are many now commercial CDMOs with experience with engineered T-cell therapy and competition across these CDMOs that have had a significant downward pressure on price is one. At the hospitals, patients, clinicians, and hospitals are now comfortable with cell therapy. It's really expanded a lot, the comfort with getting to outpatient infusion, which Tim also talked about, and that helps to improve patient access, which has been a barrier for CAR T. So this infrastructure is there that somebody with our type of therapy can plug into. And I think then if you look at today, there are next generation innovations that, for example, we and others have proof of concept for that further streamline the patient experience for CAR T, especially in autoimmune disease. And those are the ability to avoid the need for apheresis. So when you look at a patient with autoimmune disease, their cells look a lot more like healthy donors than oncology. You don't have these manufacturing failures. You could just do a blood draw. Getting away from preconditioning, we have our initial patients treated without preconditioning. You don't really need it so much, I don't believe. We're still proving that, but I don't believe we need that so much in autoimmune disease. Preconditioning helps with the anti-tumor response. So, and then the outpatient administration, and so with an autologous, and this is relevant to next generation technology, other modalities. Where I think we will be very quickly with autologous cell therapy, we're going to have these initial approvals with, preconditioning, apheresis, inpatient, might happen, although we plan to launch with outpatient. But very quickly, you're going to have, whole blood collection. We hope no preconditioning if the data meets out this year. And so the patient experience is basically go get a blood draw, come back in 4 weeks, get an outpatient infusion, go home. If you have a fever, which happens for us 30% of the time, come back in, And so that is a great patient experience. That's a very affordable experience. And I think with the safety profile and the durability that we're seeing, any new technologies are going to have to compete against that. The FDA has been very clear that if there is an existing therapy, you're going to have to do a randomized controlled study against that. So unless these new modalities come out and show a similar safety and efficacy before these initial products are on the market, then I think there's going to be a significant headwind. Now, to address new technologies, so we, over the last 2 years, have been dealing with, will bispecific disrupt ex vivo CAR T therapy, will in vivo approach. So bispecifics already have shown that they don't have the same depth, durability, and safety profile, and in vivo approaches are still quite early. I could speak to that more. I don't want to take too much time on the panel, but I think there's 2 buckets: targeted lenti, LNP RNA. Targeted lenti has some safety and infusion reaction concerns and safety concerns. LNP RNA we could talk about. It requires multiple infusions, and also both modalities are requiring high-dose steroids prior to infusion to manage infusion reactions in CRS. So I think there's an opportunity to maintain the value proposition of the ex vivo autologous cell therapies, and that's how we're thinking about it.
Makes sense. So, Allan, how are you thinking about learning from the first waves of genome editing therapies and programs, and what lessons are you taking away that you're incorporating to your strategy?
Well, first off, I think there's a lot we can learn just from the data that's been generated, just understanding a little bit about translation from animal to human. These tend to be very translatable as you go into humans, and we've seen that across a number of diseases now. Sort of dosing, having an idea of kind of where you want to be on dose, and that's been fairly consistent as you've gone company to company. There's a potential we can dose even higher, not to say that we need to based on our safety database, but that's something that we kind of pay a lot of attention to. I think what's most important is I look at what companies have done, and again, I'm not saying we wouldn't have made similar mistakes. We're just, you get to come later and you get to kind of Monday morning quarterback on some of these things. But, one, I think indication really matters. So what's, sort of standards of care exist out there? How are you going to be able to compete? And really understanding your end market early. I think and we actually, our company that did this as well, early on, sometimes when you're a platform-based company, you have this really incredible technology. You hire a bunch of great scientists, but sometimes you don't hire the business people you need to really understand what markets you want to go into, and you end up, a few years later saying, well, why are we developing X, Y, and Z? And you start doing some of that work later. And so what I would encourage people to do is really do that work at the outset, right? The science is obviously important, what's going to drive most of the value, but it's also really important to understand the business case of any program or really any investment that you make within a company. And so doing that early is going to pay dividends in the future. And so, we've seen what certain companies have done and the way they've done it, and without getting into detail, we've been able to learn from some of those. But overall, I think, we see sort of the ecosystem as every program that's a success to us is good for Prime, right? When I see a company succeed in gene editing, whether it's CRISPR base editing or another company that's doing prime editing, that's good for the field, right? I think everyone can be successful. It's really about patients at the end of the day, and we're always encouraged when there's good news. We want sort of all boats rising.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, and Curran, I want to come back to AAV safety and benefit risk. I think, as again, Tim mentioned, that was a big topic for the past year. There were some safety events and deaths in the space, including among patients treated with Elevidys, which is a Duchenne gene therapy. You obviously have a program in Duchenne, as well as other programs in the pipeline as well. So what are you guys doing across your pipeline and in your Duchenne program to ensure that the benefit risk profiles that you're generating are reasonable for patients, regulators, and the other stakeholders?
Yeah, I think I'll start with retina just to throw you off a bit, but I think the key there is we're injecting AAV into immune privileged spaces, so the choroid region and then subretinally. So we're not having to use high-dose steroids or long-term steroids to control inflammation because of that. On the high-dose indications like Duchenne, we tried to kind of deconstruct what was going on there in terms of safety. And we sort of started at the very beginning with the construct design that we have that includes the C-terminus, so it's more like natural full-length dystrophin. The second part was in manufacturing, we purified to 80% full capsid. So if you're getting dosed with 2E14 at 50% purity, you're really getting 4E14 vector copy or vector genomes. And so by going high in purity for manufacturing, we effectively lowered the dose, increasing the purity of what we were dosing. And then I think the last piece, which was really important, is different things like eculizumab, sirolimus. Those had been used in response to safety events in the field. So what we did from the very beginning of the program is we pulled those up front and dosed them prophylactically. And so now we're not seeing any of those events, liver enzyme elevation, complement activation. And so there's a bit more monitoring up front. It's a more intense regime up front, but the payoff at the back end with no SAEs in our phase 1/2 is worth it.
Got it. So Curran, maybe I'll stick with you as we talk about commercial. Again, you guys are nearing a potential launch in Hunter syndrome. How do you plan to avoid some of the prior challenges of less successful gene therapy launches in the space?
Yeah, I think for the Hunter program, it's an ultra-rare disease, so on an incidence basis, maybe 50 patients per year. The MPS Society is incredibly organized, and patient identification is very straightforward, we think. And there are known centers for dosing that we can go to that we've used in a clinical setting. And then, not the least, I keep going, I'm a chemical engineer, I'm sorry, but in manufacturing, we've got drug ready to go, just needs a label on it. So we're in good shape for launch. I think NS Pharma brings a mature sales force to bear, which we don't have. We'll build that for the Duchenne program. So we're really confident that we can have a smooth launch. I wouldn't diminish it. There are 500 patients in the prevalent population that are desperately looking for alternatives, and so we're hoping to make a significant impact to those patients.
Mm-hmm. And then coming back to the wet AMD, that's obviously an entirely different ballgame, large commercial opportunity, but also a lot of entrenched players, some late-stage competition. How are you positioning gene therapy for success there?
I have a really high level of confidence that AbbVie knows how to market this drug, so we're hoping to get really positive pivotal data. They're investing heavily in the program. And I think you've seen in wet AMD, programs that come in with extended dosing regimes take a significant chunk of the market. Imagine one that can go 3 to 4 years out, which is what our data supports to date. I think we'll exceed expectations based on that alliance with AbbVie.
Great. And Allan, you've talked about how Prime is focusing on some of these larger opportunities. Can you expand a little bit on the commercial opportunity in Alpha-1 as well as in Wilson's, and how you think about the broader potential of genome editing in some of these non-orphan indications?
Yeah, so when you take Alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, it's sort of the perfect disease for gene editing, which is probably why so many companies are operating in this
Yes,
space
others
because,
have figured this
you know,
out.
98, 99% of patients have one specific mutation, so one editor can essentially treat all of those patients. You know, there are a lot of patients walking around with, you know, that are homozygous for what's called the Z allele, or this PIS mutation in alpha-1, but it's something that we call, it's incomplete sort of, not every person walking around with this genetic phenotype actually gets the disease, right? So we think there's maybe about 10 to 15,000 patients out of the maybe 100,000 plus that have the mutation in the US that are eligible to be treated. A good percentage of these are actually being treated with something called replacement therapy today, which is still sort of debatable how well that works. There's not great, there's good biomarker data, but there's actually not a lot of great clinical data, which is a whole other topic we won't get into today. So we see this, and there's a similar market in Europe. So think about that as somewhere between 20 and 30,000 patients sort of in the developed world. It tends to be a Caucasian based disease. So actually when you go to China, Japan, Asia, the Asian population, actually it does not exist or doesn't really exist. So, you know, this is sort of, you're really focused on Europe and the US. And so that's a, you know, at least when you think about a gene editing therapy, that's a pretty decent market size where it's, you know, many, many billions of dollars. There's a few players in that market, so obviously there'll be some competition. But we do think the prime editing approach can be the superior approach there. For Wilson disease, that's really something that can only be done with prime editing. So these are predominantly what are called transversion mutations. So you can't really correct this with CRISPR or with base editing. Here, unlike alpha-1, we can't go after 99% of the patients with one editor. But the predominant mutation in the Caucasian population is about 30 to 50%. And with a handful of editors, we think we can get to about 60 to 70% of the population. There's probably about, call it 10,000 patients in the US, a similar number in Europe. But that tends to be a higher prevalence rate when you go to Asia. So here there is a really strong or high Asian population. And there with a handful of editors, different mutation background, but with a handful of editors, we think we can get to about, you know, 70+% of that population. So when you kind of put that all together, the Wilson opportunity could actually be as big as the alpha-1 opportunities. You think about it globally, and again, a multi-billion-dollar ultimate opportunity. As we think about other diseases, we are looking, you know, we talked a bit before about the leveraging of one program to another. So we do see our ability to go fast in other sort of liver-directed indications as a real probability. So there are some large indications that we're looking at, some that I think are really attractive where we could be a very differentiated approach with a prime editor. And so hopefully we'll have more to say on that, you know, as we get into the year.
Great. And Gwen, we've seen CAR-Ts for oncology start to hit blockbuster status. What is the commercial outlook from your perspective in the autoimmune disease, and how do things like pricing and value proposition and access, you know, differ in this chronic setting?
Yeah, thanks. I think I've talked about some of that, but I think one thing that's really distinct in autoimmune disease is that there's a direct cost displacement for existing therapies. So if you take myositis, for example, IVIG is used. Also, you have new therapies like JAK inhibitors or FcRn inhibitors. And these are drugs that require continuous treatment, chronic treatment, and they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So our therapy, or this just general class of therapy, will allow patients to basically be off of their therapies. If you can get that durability for 2 years or longer, that's already a positive outcome for the healthcare system. So I think that's a unique opportunity here. That combined with the other things I talked about, which are the downward pressure on production costs, the ability to consistently manufacture these patients. There's also, with autoimmune patients, they're relatively stable, so you don't lose patients as you're manufacturing. So you don't have that added cost of production due to either remanufacture or manufacturing to patients that don't ultimately end up getting the product. So it's a positive value proposition compared to oncology, and then the market is larger, and the pricing opportunities, I think, are quite advantageous as well.
Great. That sounds encouraging. So we have a few minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in one additional question, and this is on China. This is a theme that's emerged repeatedly over 2025 with respect to the speed of China biotech, particularly with respect to bringing programs into the clinic and to proof of concept quickly through their investigator-initiated trials. So how are you guys thinking about this issue, both from a competitive standpoint and also with respect to potentially being able to leverage that clinical trial ecosystem to accelerate therapy and development here? Gwen, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I can start with that. I mean, we do have some programs in preclinical development that we haven't yet disclosed, but just conceptually, when we think about advancing these new approaches quickly through clinical trials and identifying the optimal preclinical asset, getting through that dose escalation quickly, finding the patients quickly, just even the plasmid to product time frame is so much faster in China, and I think it's undisputed now that you can get really high quality data, high quality trials, high quality investigators with good selection in China, and there's a series of CDMOs or CROs out there that you can work with. It just makes sense. Even if you end up replicating the data in the US, it's cheaper and faster to at least de-risk your initial asset in China before investing the development funds in the US. So, I would love to see us or Europe find a way to do more streamlined, sort of this investigator-initiated trial type approach that China is doing, so we can continue to capture that innovation in the US. But I think, what Tim showed in his slides, showing that, China is now surpassing the US in terms of clinical trials. I think this is a big reason why, because I think as a responsible developer, you almost can't not consider China for development. But I'm curious to see what these guys are thinking.
Yeah. Do you guys have any additional thoughts?
They have a lot of things in the pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, I can add quickly. This is an area we're paying more attention to. They are ISTs, right? So you don't have full control. Yeah. And as we've seen, especially with these early technologies like gene editing, one event can really crush a sector or definitely a company. So I'm not saying they are high quality centers and high quality physicians, but that's where my hesitancy is, right? Just one event can really submarine everything. But I do think just the competitive advantage, I mean, we're not talking a little cheaper, we're talking orders of magnitude cheaper. So I think we all have to think about, is that the right path forward? And it's probably going to mean at some point just going to China, really just visiting these sites, getting a really better understanding of what it looks like, and really thinking about, do we want to do more work there?
Curran?
Yeah, I think running studies in China certainly now enters the conversation where maybe 3 years ago we would have not thought about it. So it's moving in that direction. For a company our size, 400 plus people, it's pretty daunting. We have surgical trainers in for every administration of gene therapy, and just the reach for us to China, that would make that would put a lot of strain on the organization. I think the other part I really consider strongly is when we run clinical studies, you build a relationship with the investigators. The intended market for us historically has been US. And so by not doing that, by not building that relationship and getting their experience with the drug, I think it hurts your commercial prospects down the road, and again, the control of the program. But it's definitely something we consider now as part of a new program every time.
Fantastic. All right, I think this brings us to the end of our session. So thank you guys again for the fantastic discussion, and thank you guys for the attention.